With the binding constraints that Eskom has been on the economy seemingly resolved, the next biggest constraint on economic activity and investment is, of course, Transnet, which retains in many ways a de facto monopoly on South Africa's ports and railway networks. There have been signs towards reform, but unfortunately, as tends to be the case in South Africa, a lot of that momentum in terms of rhetoric could be undermined by the details of certain policies and, of course, when it comes to final implementation. So joining me to unpack the state of Transnet and some of these moves towards ostensible reform is our fellow CRA Analyst Carika Middelberg. Carika, thanks very much once again for your time here on the CRA YouTube channel. In a recent client note of yours, which we will highlight on the screen and link to in the description below, you unpack, for example, the recent network statement released by Transnet at the end of last year, as well as a few other tweaks and moves that have been coming out of the state-owned logistics company. So just give us a little bit of background. When was the network statement first released? And do you think initially, at least, it was good enough?
Yeah, so the first network statement was released by TRIM, so that stands for Transnet Railway Infrastructure Manager. So that was released in April of 2024. In the initial statement, I think it was still very much government's perception of private sector participation in terms of very high tariffs. They had a 5% flat rate on top of the tariffs, and a lot of other agreements, conditions that the private sector had to adhere to. So I think that was still very much an unrealistic take on how government would need to structure their invitation to the private sector in terms of to make it as attractable as possible for companies to participate in these concessions. So following the network statement was reviewed by both TRIM, Transnet and the Ministry for Transport, and the updated version was released in middle December, at the end of December of 2024, where they lowered their tariffs, they got rid of the 5% flat rate, and they also updated some of their other conditions.
And Carika, if we look at the history of Transnet, I mean, in its various names and iterations in South Africa's history, it has always almost been a monopoly, so a state-owned monopoly. So in and of itself, the fact that a network statement was put out to explore, I think, whether there would be appetite for private sector investment was in some ways a radical departure from what had come before for many decades, before this particular network statement. But of course, where the rubber meets the road, as it were, to use that analogy, is, are those terms attractive enough? So what did you see in terms of how industry engaged with Transnet and sort of Transnet subsidiaries as they looked at the network statement and tried to get Transnet and other Transnet entities to make the terms of engagement, maybe the terms of investment, more attractive?
Yeah, so I think it's important to highlight that since 2023, when Transnet started introducing these private-public partnerships, this is the first time in Transnet's history that something like this is happening. So since 2023, this is quite a big thing that is happening for Transnet. Like you said, I mean, since South Africa's unification in 1910, railways and ports have been government owned, and it's never been privately owned or privately operated. And since then, Transnet was first like a fully state owned. It wasn't even like a state owned company. It was like a ministry or portfolio managed by the government, and then since evolved to a state owned company where the government is the main and only shareholder. So I think that's just important to remember, that this is the first time in Transnet's history that the private sector has ever participated within its operations at this level. For me, and in my analysis, it's a very good signal that Transnet is sending when it updated the network statement. Since then, Greenrod, and like we have seen with the ports as well, Maersk and the Philippines company have all stated their interests in operating or participating in these concessions. So thus far, the government or Transnet has made these deals attractive enough for private sector to be willing to operate these concession agreements?
I think a key sticking point, and this is where one gets to the separation between rhetoric versus actual implementation, is, for example, that the terms of investment or running operations put forward don't include for private companies or operators to own infrastructure. So they're invited to invest. So you need to outlay however many millions or billions of capital. But then when it comes to decisions around the infrastructure and the ownership thereof, of just parts of railway corridors or whole railway corridors, various infrastructure aspects of those, that decision will ultimately remain with Transnet. So do you think that even that goalpost will eventually be shifted, where Transnet acknowledges, to really get competition and investment going, it needs to allow for private ownership of infrastructure?
Yeah, so there are murmurings of Transnet allowing, possibly in the future, the investment for private sectors to invest and upkeep the infrastructure themselves. However, this far in the network statement and with the public-private partnership that in the Transnet port terminals that we have seen, government is still very reluctant to release that level of control to involve the private sector. So thus far, government is very a hard line on only sticking to operations and operational activities. They are not yet releasing control of building, maintaining, investing into infrastructure. So I think this will come with time, especially when the private sector starts operating government infrastructure. I think that will be a wake-up call to government and Transnet, about in what poor condition the infrastructure really is and how much of a potential and capacity there are for infrastructure to expand. So I think that is something that will come with time. But for now, I think government, seeing as this is such a big move, we've never seen this before, that Transnet releases their operational control. So I think for now, they are still very hesitant and still testing the waters, as one might say.
And Carika, just a final question around what is needed in terms of investing in infrastructure. So, and we're seeing this across many sectors. We see it at the moment in water infrastructure in places like Johannesburg. You see it in the electricity space, where while the generation side seems to be taken care of, the transmission side is encountering many problems. And this is the consequence of decades of not investing the necessary amounts in infrastructure. And even where the budgets are allocated, that funding doesn't go towards the ends that it should do. A lot of it is lost to waste and corruption and other ends. So just in terms of what Transnet has put out, what do they need in terms of numbers to maintain their current rail infrastructure?
Barbara Creasy announced on par with the network statement that, and also in the government's turnaround strategy for freight and rail, that by 2030 they want to reach 250 million tons moved per annum on South Africa's railways. Currently, we are not close to that figures. We are hovering around 130 million, 120 million. There has been a significant decrease in the past 5 years as well, which is making it difficult. So as I said earlier, this indicates to us that there's a big scope and potential for TFR and TRIM to increase the capacity of South African railways. So together with the network statement, the TRIM CEO stated that TRIM will need 65 billion rand to reach the 250 million tons freight reached per annum. So that is quite a lot of money. And apart from the money, it's quite a high target from the Ministry of Transport if we're considering what Transnet is delivering now. And we are already in 2025, so that will be in 5 years' time. However, that's why government opened up the railways for these private concessions to harness the funds to reach this number to improve capacity. But yeah, like we have said in the previous question that TRIM will definitely need to have some form of participation with the private sector in maintaining and investing and building new infrastructure. I don't think that burden can be left on Transnet alone.
So all in all, we're seeing some possible improvements here and there, at least in terms of rhetoric and what came before. But as always, we'll need to see how far Transnet and the government goes with actual implementation and ultimately letting go of some of its infrastructure to let private sector players come in, share expertise, build up capital, etc., ultimately to the benefit of South Africa's trade and logistics space, which at this point in time, I think is holding back things like the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and other just ideas around getting the easier movement of goods around South Africa and the sub-Saharan African region. But Carika, thanks once again for your time. Much appreciated. To all of you, thanks very much for watching, and we'll be back soon with more from the CRA. Take care. Bye-bye.